the political force in any Home Rule Parliament that came into existence. Murphy was going to be typical of the new Ireland that was going to be established when Home Rule came in. But people like Murphy feared the people who lived in the slums. And the reason he feared the people who lived in the slums is because this new unionism, as established by Connolly and Larkin in 1909, was completely different from any other trade unionism that had been seen before, either in Britain or in Ireland. Prior to this, Irish trade unionism was on a par with British trade unionism, and basically what I mean by that is that it was moderate, it was reformist, it believed in working inside the system on an incremental basis, improving terms and conditions through negotiation. Larkin and Connolly were completely different from that. Larkin had cut his teeth in the National Union of Dock Labourers over here in Liverpool, and of course he was born in Liverpool. He was sent over to Belfast, and he organised very successfully the dockers' strike in Belfast, which united, for the first, nearly the last time, Protestant and Catholic workers in 1907. And Connolly from Edinburgh had cut his teeth in America, and had been in America for 10 years, and then he came back to Ireland shortly before the Irish Transport and General Workers Union was set up. But the Irish Transport and General Workers was a radical departure from the National Union of Dock Labourers. The National Union of Dock Labourers was led by reformists, British Labour politicians, such as James Sexton, who himself was Irish, incidentally, went on to become a Labour MP. But they were moderate, reforming British Labourites, if you know what I mean. Connolly and Larkin were revolutionaries. They were revolutionary syndicalists. And that's why it always makes me laugh when as I heard it on the RTE programme a couple of weeks ago, that said that Connolly and Larkin were determined that Dublin working men should get a fair day's pay for a fair day's work, and they were all about improving working conditions and all the rest of it. Well, they may have been about that, but that wasn't their raison d'etre. They believed in using revolutionary syndicalism, that is the use of the strike, to effect political change. Now, this was a continental political theory, but most prevalent in France. It was completely foreign to British trade unionism and Irish trade unionism. And that's the reason why Murphy and the employers feared it and hated it, because it was a brand new form of trade unionism which would undermine, if it was allowed its head and it was allowed to be successful, it would undermine their control of the Irish economy. The form of trade unionism that Larkin and Connolly was putting forward was a radical, revolutionary form of trade unionism and labour politics, which made Murphy and his colleagues even more determined to nip it in the bud, to destroy it before it had a time to take root. Murphy was regarded, paradoxically, as a benevolent employer. He recognised trade unions. He recognised craft trade unions. He recognised trade unions which were moderate, which sought to improve the terms and conditions of people with skills. What Murphy was aghast about was Larkin and Connolly trying to trade unionise and organise general workers. By general workers, we mean people with no skills. The dockers, the carters, the railway men, and the people who worked on the trams, which William Martin Murphy ran. And as I said, he was a progressive employer. He believed in introducing new technological innovation. He was adept at using the new communications that people like Marconi had just introduced. So from one perspective, he's a progressive, benevolent employer. But what he's not prepared to do is at all tolerate the trade unionisation of the great mass of the unwashed, basically, living in the slums of Dublin. And on this, he's not alone. He's not alone. Many of the Catholic middle class, many nationalists, many home rulers were either ambivalent or totally against what Larkin and Connolly were all about. Let me read you from the publication, The Irish Catholic. This is the weekly newspaper of obviously the Catholic Church, the Catholic hierarchy. And it says, quote, at the time of the lockout, "Into Dublin streets have poured all the foul reserves of the slums, human beings whom life in the most darksome depths of a great city has deprived most of the characteristics of civilization." You know, this isn't from sort of Anglo-Irish ascendancy. This is from the official organ of the Roman Catholic Church. And before we start to get too, you know, what shall I say, complacent ourselves, you know, I think you can still identify certain elements of this in the attitude that a lot of people have to, for example, Northsiders in Dublin to this day. You know, some of it is told in joke form, but there's still there's that fear and that resentment that if they were allowed in any way to become politically organised, they will overwhelm the established order of things. Similar attitudes were expressed by, for example, Arthur Griffith, the founder of Sinn Féin. Now, Griffith was adamantly against Larkin and Connolly and the trade unionisation of the general workers because he saw it as interfering with the rights of the native Irish entrepreneur to basically make money and develop the country. Griffith's economic policy was that Irish native businessmen should be encouraged. This is the policy of the independent Irish government from 1922 up until Lamass in 1960. Should be encouraged, no barrier should be put in their way, basically to make money and to improve the wealth and prosperity of the country. That's why Griffith was against it. It's not only Griffith. I mentioned the Irish Republican Brotherhood. They regarded it, people like Tom Clark, Sean McDermott regarded the lockout as a sideshow, that it directed the attentions and all the efforts of the Catholic working class away from the true struggle, which should be about independence from Britain. The poets and the mystic nationalists of the Gaelic revival, people like Pearse, MacDonagh, Plunkett, you'll realise that I'm talking about the people who came together to form the basis of the 1916 Rising. They were ambivalent towards the whole movement towards trade unionisation and the industrial struggle. Porrick Pearse had substantial reservations. Porrick Pearse and James Connolly never got on. Arguably, they didn't get on when they were in the GPO in O'Connell Street in 1916. But Connolly was enlisted, hijacked, if you like, into the 1916 Rising, into the planning of the 1916 Rising, because he said after the defeat of the lockout, after the defeat of the workers, that he didn't care whether or not the militant Republicans of the IRB or people like Pearse were going to strike a blow for freedom. He and his Irish citizen army are going to strike a blow for freedom because until the national revolution is established, there's no chance whatsoever of the socialist revolution taking place. But as late as 1915, Connolly was describing Pearse as a blithering ninny. And the reason he described him as a blithering ninny is because I think it was in his speech over the grave of O'Donovan Rossa in 1915, Pearse was talking, you know, in those very florid terms that he was renowned for, about the arid earth being replenished by the blood of Irish Republicans, Irish nationalists. And in response to that, Connolly said, yes, he's talking about the blood of working class people. What a blithery ninny that man is. You know, less than 12 months later, they're on the same side in the Easter Rising. But I'd like to quote you, just before I move on from this, W.B. Yeats's great poem, September 1913. Now Yeats, as we know, a scion of the Anglo-Irish ascendancy, and a bit of a snob, you know, not too happy himself about the way that the Catholic middle class are taking over the place. But, you know, the poem, September 1913, very, very descriptive of this growing Catholic middle-class entrepreneurial section of society, which is just waiting. It's just waiting to actually come into its own with the establishment of a Home Rule Parliament. So in his poem, September 1913, written at the time of the lockout, although it wasn't written about the lockout, Yeats was in particular pretty miffed about the refusal of the Home Rule dominated corporation to actually agree to the establishment of the Hugh Lane Gallery, all the art pictures that Hugh Lane, the famous art collector, had donated to Dublin Corporation, and he said that the Philistine Corporation, in turning down the pictures, was showing its basically its well, Philistine attitude to these things. And he says in his poem, "What need you, being come to sense, but fumble in a greasy till, and add the halfpence to the pence, and prayer to shivering prayer, until you have dried the marrow from the bone? For men were born to pray and save, romantic Ireland's dead and gone, it's with O'Leary in the grave." Yeats is making the comparison between these sort of grasping capitalists who now seem to be on the verge of actually forming the government of Ireland under the Home Rule Parliament, with the great romantic nationalist John O'Leary, one of the leaders of the 1848 rise in previous generations, who he believed, you know, was completely above all this sort of stuff, had high principles, you know, and wouldn't get involved in the filthy business of sort of making money. That's Yeats's comment on the class that was now coming into its own in early 20th century Dublin, and the class that were adamantly against what Larkin and Connolly were attempting to do. Well, as we know, the strike, or the lockout as it was, could only have succeeded, and it's debatable whether or not it could ever have succeeded, because if you look at it, it wasn't the most propitious time to actually withdraw your labour, even though they were locked out, because for every man who went on strike in the Dublin of the pre-First World War, there were more than 10 workers who were unemployed, who were seeking to provide for their family, and were only too prepared to take the job of the striker and probably to work for far less. And thus the risk of scabbing was particularly high in Dublin of 1913. In pure Marxist terms, when you look at it, there were too many workers going for too few jobs. So it wasn't the best time to go on strike. But in retrospect, if the British trade unions, who did financially support the strikers, had managed to black goods coming from people like Murphy, from the Dublin entrepreneurs, black their entry into Britain, that may have made a difference. But and in the end, Connolly actually blamed the British trade unions for being too timid, too restrained, too moderate. But that basically, it seems, was an attempt to deflect criticism away from himself and Larkin and their leadership of the strike, because at the end of the day, the docks in Liverpool in particular only had 50% union membership themselves, which is probably little more than the union membership in Dublin. And so it's highly unlikely, even if the British trade unions had declared that they were black goods coming from Dublin, that they would have been able to make that stick. And we have to say, I mean, the curse of Irish labour throughout the 20th century, disunity, personal differences. Larkin and Connolly were difficult men to get on with. They didn't, to put it mildly, they didn't work very closely together. Connolly regarded Larkin as charismatic but headstrong. Larkin regarded Connolly as pretty much the same, and there was a lot of ambivalence between the two of them. And incidentally, the Irish nationalists who were against the strike, people like Murphy in his newspaper, the Irish Independent, they were not averse to describing the lockout as being led by foreign agitators. They were not averse to using the Irish Ireland card, describing Larkin from Liverpool and Connolly from Edinburgh as foreign agitators, you know, who were interfering in Irish affairs and trying to bamboozle the poor, ignorant Catholic working class. Net result, as we see, is the defeat of the trade unionists in 1913. The other point I must make at this stage is that whereas in 1907 there was a joint unity of purpose between Protestant and Catholic workers in Belfast, even though that strike was defeated, by 1913, of course, those Protestant workers, or the majority of them, were not particularly interested in trade unionism, were not particularly interested in solidarity with their Dublin comrades. They were all enrolling in the UVF in advance of what they saw as the horror of Home Rule taking place. So the divisions in the Irish working class on national lines were already becoming prevalent, and in fact had rapidly accelerated from 1907, the 5 or 6 year period from 1907 to 1913. When the strike finished, Larkin left for the United States. He never returned to Ireland until 1923. He became active in American trade unionism, in the Wobblies, the International Workers of the World. He was a colleague of, I think he was executed by then, the famous trade union leader Joe Hill, shot in the mines in Utah. I think that was just before Larkin came over. Larkin himself was jailed in Sing Sing for sedition, and never came back to Ireland until 1923. So he missed the whole of, the events, 1916, the War of Independence, Civil War, and all the rest of it. Connolly, of course, as we know, came to the conclusion with the defeat of the workers' struggle that he had to throw in his lot with the militant revolutionaries of the IRB and with the mystical poets of the Gaelic revival, people like Pearse, and as they say, the rest is history, 1916. And that's why I say that there is an argument, and I personally believe this argument, that Connolly chose the wrong tactic. It was never ever going to be the case that the British were going to be driven out of Dublin in 1916. It was never ever going to be the case that the working class could be politicised by military struggle against the British. And what happened? With the other great leader of Irish trade unionism removed from the field over in the United States, Connolly sacrifices not only his own life, but also the lives of the workers' militia, the Irish Citizen Army, which had been set up in the autumn of 1913 to act as a workers' defence force against the attacks by the Dublin Metropolitan Police against the strikers. Lennon described the Irish Citizen Army as the first workers' militia. Now, you don't have to be a sort of a Marxist revolutionary to realise that there was real revolutionary, radical potential there in 1913-14. My argument is that it was dissipated in 1916 with Connolly's fatal decision to become part of a bourgeois, middle-class, nationalist revolution, and I was talking right at the beginning about the impact of the First World War on change in Irish politics. By 1916, there were 200 members of the Irish Citizen Army in the GPO, well, in all sides, 200 of the former strikers, the former trade unionists, well, current trade unionists and the Irish Transport and General Workers in 1916, fighting alongside the Irish Volunteers. There were 10 times that number in the British Army by 1916, fighting on the Western Front. 2,000 members of the Irish Transport and General Workers Union who had been out on strike in the autumn of 1913 were now, 3 years later, in the British Army. And it's easy to see why. If you're dependent upon casual pay, you don't know where the next penny's coming from, you don't know where the rent's coming from, you don't know how you're going to put bread on the table. Join the army. I mean, disillusionment was creeping in by 1916, what with the Gallipoli fiasco and all the rest of it. But you still had substantial numbers of Irish soldiers in the British Army where they could enjoy regular pay, family support, pensions, etc., etc. And that's why it's one of the great ironies of 1916 that there were so many Irish volunteers because of the Irish diaspora, with Cockney, Geordie, Scottish, Scouse accents, being confronted by real Jackines, Dubliners from the Liberties, for example, serving in the Royal Dublin Fusiliers. And the whole situation was reversed. It was the British soldiers from the Royal Dublin Fusiliers that were to the forefront in confronting the Irish volunteers with English accents. I always find that one of the ironies of 1916. And given that so many Royal Dublin Fusilier soldiers were killed in putting down the 1916, Dubliners were killed in putting down the 1916 rising. John Dillon, who at the time was deputy leader of the Home Rulers, the Irish Parliamentary Party, and became leader of the Home Rule Party when John Redmond died in 1918, he stood up in the House of Commons, this is just before they left over conscription, he stood up in the House of Commons and he said to the British Prime Minister, look, the willingness of the loyal Dublin soldiers and the Royal Dublin Fusiliers to put their lives on the line in the service of the Empire is even more reason why you should grant Home Rule to Ireland. This was the constant Home Rule argument, the reason why Redmond had encouraged the Irish volunteers to enlist in the British Army in the first place, that Britain would reward loyal Ireland at the end of the war for participating in the First World War. Well, I'll just try and round it off. Let's look what happens post-1916. Connolly's gone, dead. Larkin's gone in America. Control of the Irish Labour and Transport and General Workers Union reverts back to the reformist labour and trade union politicians who had control before. People like James Sexton. Thomas Johnson, who was an Englishman, who was leader of the Irish Labour Party throughout the whole of the 1920s. William O'Brien, who hated, it's fair enough to say that, both Larkin and O'Connolly, because he thought they were erratic and their politics were unrealistically revolutionary. Johnson, as leader of the Irish Labour Party, took the decision, the fateful decision in 1918, not to participate in the general election. Sinn Féin put pressure on them, yes, and in return for a vague commitment to the democratic programme of the first Dáil in 1919, the Irish Labour Party decided to sit out the 1918 general election. And although De Valera never said what he's accused of saying, Labour must wait, this was a newspaper headline, De Valera never said it. Basically, that's what's been happening ever since. You know, Labour's been waiting in the politics of independent Ireland until, well, arguably for the next 100